The shaman is the one who maintains the connection to the roots of religion and to the roots of culture and civilization. Without the shaman, the culture could not continue to exist because it would just be completely psychotic, really. It would be subject to collective movements and dissociations of consciousness from the spiritual center of the universe, which is where the shaman operates.
Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Jungian Analyst Steven Herrmann. So welcome, Steven.
Thank you, John. Nice to be here this evening with you in California.
Steven, I'm looking forward to talking with you about William Everson, Shaman's Call, your book.
Mhm.
But first, I was going to ask if we could maybe just start with how you got into Jung and met Sandner, met Everson. Could you tell us a little bit about that, some of your own story?
Sure. Well, there's a number of synchronicities there, a number of meaningful coincidences, because my first Jungian analyst when I was 20 was an 80-year-old Jungian who had been to Zurich, and her name was Catherine, and she was 60 years my senior. She was the wise old woman, and I was with her for a year. And working on dreams. And I went to one of her vision seminars at her home. There was about 40 people there doing active imagination or active visioning. And she invited Donald Sandner to come and to be an interpreter of the visions. And he was at the San Francisco Jung Institute at the time. So that's how I met. I didn't meet Don Sandner that day. I didn't approach him. Because I was one of the 40 participants. But it was really Catherine who later would drive me to, in her old beat up Volvo, a white Volvo, to meet Donald Sandner at his right next to his office. And but this is after I was at Santa Cruz, you see, because my transit went from the Bay Area here from Walnut Creek, where I was living, to then UC Santa Cruz, where I got my bachelor's in depth psychology and religion. I wrote my own major. Everson played a part in that as a mentor. I met Bill Everson by chance. I took his course, Birth of a Poet, in 1978. And went to see him for 4 sessions during his office hours at the time, and for spiritual directing or counseling, because he was a Dominican,
Right.
as well as being a Jungian poet, and quite a creative, novel developer of some of Jung's ideas, one of which is the shamanic archetype that Don Sandner was so interested in later. When I was in analysis with Don, he asked me to, because Everson had called me to return 10 years after I had served as his teaching assistant in Birth of a Poet, to come down and interview him on shamanism and American poetry. And Don Sandner had planted the seed, gave me some of the questions to ask Everson. Of course, most of the questions were mine, but Don had a particular interest in Everson because of this. Don Sandner was the foremost authority on shamanism and Jungian or analytical psychology in the United States, and had gone to all the Jungian institutes throughout the nation and did drumming for the institutes and shamanic drumming. And I later purchased my first drum, the Taos Pueblo, in 1995, after the interviews with Everson. So the interviews were 1991 to 1993, a year before Everson's death. he died in 1994. Mhm.
I
So
mean,
that
I've
gives
got a quick question. Is how what were you doing at 20? Getting into at 20, getting into Jungian
Well,
analysis and
my mother had been to Catherine's seminar at UC San Francisco
yeah,
Extension, and she took a course from Catherine. And she came back and told me about this old woman who had been talking ecstatically about Jung and was teaching Answer to Job. And she purchased me a copy of Man and His Symbols and gave it to me, my mother. And I read it, and it just changed my life. Man and His Symbols. Jung starts off the book with 7 essays, now in volume 18 of his collected works, Symbols and the Interpretation of Dreams. So I had been reading Sigmund Freud's Interpretation of Dreams in 1995, and I had to put the book down after 100 pages because something didn't quite click with me. But when I read Jung's book, everything just opened up, a whole inner world. And I began to have these art. It's not just that I started to have archetypal dreams, I began to understand archetypal dreams from through Jung's glasses, his lens. He gives us the method or technique by which we can interpret our own dreams. And so I began that way. And by the time I got to Catherine, I was a bit depressed and uh, ready for Jungian analysis. And right away,
you're lucky you got your depression early. A sign of good fortune.
Jung often talked about a neurosis being a blessing, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
And Donald Sandner, I'm just covering a little bit
yeah.
for everyone that's listening. Donald Sandner was an authority in the sense that he wrote The Sacred Heritage, didn't he? Which was
Yes, that was his second book. His first major book was Navajo Symbols of Healing, which is where he had his initiation into the drum from a medicine man named Natani Tso. He was a medicine man who Don studied under and uh, researched Navajo sand paintings and mandalas and began to. I mean, this is a very seminal book because it's still taught at San Jose State University. An anthropologist there uses it. So that was his first book where he made a mark on the field as a
mm,
psychiatrist. He was a
mm,
psychiatrist. And then, yes, he wrote The Sacred Heritage after that. In fact, he was writing The Sacred Heritage when he was giving me questions to go down and ask Everson about. So I think we were both influencing one another, Don and
mm.
I, along the lines of poetry, because he had a background in literature and English. Um, Don did. And uh, he basically told me that if I was going to write a book after the interviews with Everson on shamanism and American poetry, I had to read Emily Dickinson, first
Yeah,
of all.
yeah.
Secondly, I had to read Herman Melville's Moby Dick.
Mm,
And I basically took those recommendations and wrote my first essay on Dickinson.
mm,
After Everson's death, right in 1995, after Everson died, I wrote my first Jungian essay on shamanism in Emily Dickinson's poetry. And I've since published a book on Emily Dickinson as a medicine woman for our times in 2018.
mm.
2018.
And
So
then you were kind of focusing on shamanism in American poetry, weren't you? And then,
yeah, yeah.
mm,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
this led you to, well, synchronistically, it seems to me, tell me if I'm wrong, it seems to me that synchronistically you became his assistant.
I became his Exactly. I became his assistant in Birth of a Poet. I was his last teaching assistant.
mm,
He taught the course for 10 years at UC Santa Cruz, and I was probably his seventh or eighth teaching assistant. Um, So I was with him till the end of his course, the last 5 quarters. And I led the dream groups. So it was groups of 100 students who were all searching for their vocation through their dream life. That was
Mm,
the aim of the course. And I taught Jung on dream interpretation since I had that essay from my 20th year, much of which I had memorized. And I basically taught that to the students and then helped them in dream groups interpret their own dreams and look for vocational symbols in their dreams. And that's where I began my research on vocational dreams was in Bill's course as his TA. Also looking at my own dreams as well, because I had to write a final essay myself and focus on the same subject.
mm, yeah.
So to see it, and interestingly enough, there were shamanic symbolisms in my dreams, shamanic figures who came to me, and
Mm,
even Everson came and conferred upon me a kind of a nod, you could say, a numinous nod around the fact that I had some kind of shamanism myself, not to be a shaman, but I think to write about shamanism
yeah,
and
right.
to not only in American poetry, but in analytical psychology, Jungian psychology. So in a way, I had two mentors simultaneously, Everson
Mm,
and then Sandner.
mm,
Catherine was my earlier mentor, but
mm,
uh, she basically played a role in introducing me to Don, who I
yeah.
saw for 13 years in analysis up until the end, until his death on Easter morning, 1997. He died of a heart attack
You
on
had
Easter morning.
you had 13 years in analysis with Donald Sandner. Is that what
Yes.
you're saying?
Mm.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was very fortunate to have been
Mm,
able to know him during his really when he was coming into his own. Those last 10 years of his life, 13 years were very powerful years for him in terms of his emergence as a real authority on the subject of analytical psychology and shamanism. Yeah. And later, after his death, I joined a drumming group that he started with 10 analysts and members of his drumming circle that was a Colorado group, which was quite large, but it was a smaller group. And we drummed for over a decade together, envisioned
it, it
drumming. And
could it could end up coming out, something like the Bob Dylan's garage sessions or something like that. You might get the Colorado drumming group sessions coming out sometime. Something to look up on YouTube.
I'd
I
never
mean,
seen
um,
that.
yeah, so let's get on to your work with William Everson. I mean, I would like to make just one point, as a kind of half-reformed ex-60s love child or something like that. I think, and especially coming from another country as well, we heard about Jack Kerouac and we heard about Allen Ginsberg and some of those poets. But it wasn't until later that I became aware there was a little kind of San Francisco school of poetry, wasn't there? And that was
You're
interesting.
absolutely
And
right. Yeah. The San Francisco Renaissance. Mhm. The
San
San
Francisco,
Francisco Renaissance. And Jaime De Angulo played a big part in that as a kind of shamanic figure, a literary figure, because he had been up to do research with the Achomawi tribe in Northern California near Mount Shasta. And so he wrote books on his time with the native peoples of California, Northern California. And I think that played an influence on the San Francisco beat generation. They came out of the San Francisco Renaissance. And Gary Snyder played a part in that too. And uh, Kerouac, Ginsberg. Everson was really pointing to the shamanic element in American poetry,
yeah.
which is what we discuss in the book, The Shaman's Call.
Mm.
And
So
also
it,
Everson.
It just
role.
it just strikes me too that it kind of there's something more about the roots, the tradition. Like we know about the New Age, but then this was a conversation about the roots and the traditions and the
Right,
ancestral backings, if we want to put it like
right.
that.
Well, there is something about the spirit of place, and it's a mystery. We don't know fully how these movements emerge in different cultures of the world, but it's very clear that out of that movement and later figures like Alan Watts,
Mm,
who made that link between East and West,
mm,
and with his books and teaching, and then you had uh, the whole LSD movement and San Francisco, and out of that arose the California Institute of Integral Studies,
mm,
which was the first transpersonal institution on the West Coast here in the Bay Area. And then in 1975, the ITP, the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology. So there's something about that, what you're talking about there, that link, that connection to the transcendent
mm,
in psychology, that there really there were somehow underground energies, forces, movements through charismatic individuals, some of them poets, some of them anthropologists like Jaime De Angulo. He was also a poet, but and a writer. But there is something about the Bay Area culture and this emergence of New Age kind of thinking. But I wouldn't call Everson New Age, nor Robinson Jeffers or
mm,
uh, any of those poets you mentioned, the Beat generation. They were prior to, I think, this New Age movement that sometimes has lost its roots, you see. The
mm.
shaman is the one who maintains the connection to the roots of religion and to the roots of culture and civilization. Without the shaman, the culture could not continue to exist because it would just be completely psychotic, really. It would be subject to collective movements and um, dissociations of consciousness from the spiritual center of the universe, which is where the shaman operates. You know, from that link between normative consciousness and the suprapersonal, uh, unconscious or superconscious. We see the same thing in ancient India. The rishis of India were basically shamans. You know, they spoke the Vedas in verses. It was
Mm.
chanted, you know, out of, you know, their connection through yoga
Mm.
techniques
Mm.
to the syllables, you know, the sacred syllables, the word, you see, like in the Gospel of.
I always remember hearing in India that Om was said to be the original sound of the universe. But it strikes me that I remember when, I mean, this is a bit of an excursion maybe, but when neuro-linguistic programming was around in the corporate sector, and it's probably still around, it was very strong there for a while. Um,
Mhm.
they talked about visual people and auditory people and kinesthetic
Yeah,
people. It strikes me that often the auditory is forgotten a little when sometimes it's the most powerful, the singing, the the it's
yeah.
the one that really reaches very deeply, you know?
You're onto something very significant there, John, I believe, because not everybody is an auditory type, you see. Even Jung himself acknowledged he was not the auditory type.
Mm,
He was the visual type. He was a visionary, Jung.
yeah.
If you look at his red book, and at times poetry breaks through,
Mm,
but it's pretty much a dialogue there, a conversation with unconscious figures from the collective unconscious. Whereas for someone like Everson or Robinson Jeffers,
mm,
or Walt Whitman,
mm,
or the rishis of India, you get this auditory um, organ of consciousness that hears verses that are really rhythms or waves.
mm,
Waves, they pick up thought patterns and waves from deep, you know, places in the psyche,
mm,
very deep. And I think that's what it's the closest thing to the musician.
mm,
When we think about music, I mean, I think about Beethoven as probably the greatest shaman that ever lived. I mean, in the musical field.
mm,
And he was deaf by the time he wrote, these great uh,
mm,
concertos, the Emperor Piano Concerto Number 5. He was completely deaf, and same thing with the Ninth Symphony.
mm,
So he, in a way, was in touch with these auditory centers in the brain, you could say the olfactory lobes,
mm,
where he was hearing the harmony of the spheres. He was in touch, and that's what the shaman connects with, is this very deep source of rhythm. That's why the drum is so significant, and the rattle, because it puts one in touch with deep vibratory energies in the psyche that one can actually study through brain research, because the brain waves go down from to theta waves, the deepest, slowest brain waves, and breathing completely goes down, and the whole autonomic nervous system is silenced. The parasympathetic catches catches fire, and
and this is in contrast with maybe with, the screen time we're having now, which
oh,
is
it's
so the glittering images, as Camille Paglia mentions, the quick, fast um,
yeah,
images that we're being exposed to. But from what you were just saying, I'm getting this like this that the sound is often that slow, deepest, eternal kind of substratum, which
right, right.
it can
Mhm.
is therefore often the most effective, the most
Yeah.
um, powerful.
Yes. Oh, I think it has a healing source, and that's the word itself. That the shaman as poet. Everson, in an interview with Albert Gelpi at Stanford in 1976, gave that wonderful essay. The poet is as prophet. The poet is prophet. And there he says that the American poet who really has a calling to tap into these deep, resonant sources of music and language moves from the poet, the modern poet, to the prophet, like the Old Testament prophets, Jonah and Isaiah and Jeremiah, to the shaman. The shaman is the deepest underlying reservoir, you could say, for the psychic energies of transformation within the race consciousness. And these are transgressive of uh, modern discourse around, or postmodern political discourse around cultural appropriation, for example, because the poet as shaman, when the poet wears that mantle, like Everson did, in a very sacred manner, um, uh, moves beyond any uh, appropriation of any one cultural form, whether it be in California or the Plains Indian nations of the Dakotas, for example, or the southwestern tribes. moves deeper down, much deeper down into the race consciousness, because the evolution of our species here in the North American continent really probably started, as anthropologists are telling us, from migrations down from Asia across the steppes and the Bering Strait, or down through the Pacific corridor. It's not clear, but they found Clovis points here that go back 14,000 years BC. And the anthropologists, archaeologists are telling us the presence of humans on the North American continent could be much older than that. We don't know how old yet, but the point is uh, the shamanic archetype is a very ancient thing that any person who is called to a shamanic vocation can tap into. Not everybody is called to connect with it, but I've seen in my analytic work with patients that sometimes a patient will have a dream where they're instructed by an actual shaman figure who comes to them and communicates some kind of a message for them about their work and what they're to do with their life energies. But I agree. I think that what we're seeing today with all that visual overstimulation, particularly since the invention of the iPhone or the you know social media, is the risk of being fixed to superficiality and not being able to tap into anything of depth anymore, and then being lost without some kind of guidance from, and the analyst also traces this history, you could say, from
Yeah.
modern analyst
Yeah.
to the healer, you could say in Greek culture, Asclepius, but even
Mm.
further back to the shaman. And that's what Don Sandner was really most interested in, was the healer as shaman of the tribe.
I always remember something James Hillman said that Jung opened the mouth of the dead, which has always stuck with me. That,
Yeah.
and what I get from what you've been saying is that that kind of ancestral realm or that psychoid realm or that depth dimensional realm is
Yeah.
available to everyone. And yes,
Okay.
that when we talk about the shaman, that not everyone might be called to that path, but the shaman or the depth psychologist or the analyst in modern language or whatever can help us, can mediate some of
Mhm.
that terrain.
Mhm.
Would
Mhm.
that be a way of?
Yeah, I think that was well put. Um, it's not that the analyst identifies with the archetype of the shaman, because we don't conduct our work in a state of trance like the shaman, or in an ecstatic state of consciousness, in ecstasy. Nevertheless, we learn from uh, dreams which have a numinous quality that there are energies in the psyche that really are mind altering. And when we descend deep enough through dreams into the collective unconscious and beyond, what Jung called the psychoid, you just named the psychoid, uh, a term he didn't develop until much later in his writing. Um, then we're talking about something elemental. The poets Jung learned from, primarily Wolfgang uh, uh, von Goethe, Friedrich Schiller, and Friedrich Nietzsche. He learned so much from. I mean, he gave a seminar it's close to 1,500 pages, the two volumes on Nietzsche, 5 years of seminars, and I've read those. Uh, Jung does mention the medicine man or the shaman in his writings. I have a paper, an unpublished paper on analytical psychology and shamanism, where I basically talk about Jung's Jung's writings on shamanism and how it came into his seminars and um, its impact on him. But he just opened the door because Mircea Eliade's book, Shamanism, wasn't published till 1950. And so when he wrote The Philosophical Tree, which is a seminal essay where he focuses on shamanism, he does give credit to Eliade, but it was much later in his writings. I mean, he was 75 by that time. And so we see some of it in his very early writings. Um,
And he
he
did have
talks
that.
about
He did have that.
art.
So, I'm sorry, I might be jumping ahead, but he did have a connection. We were talking before the podcast started to the Pueblo.
Oh, to the Pueblo peoples, the Taos Pueblo.
Mm,
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting story, and it's a story that's told from a somewhat biased perspective by biographers of Jung, because, and even in his semi-autographical memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, it appears as if the elder Mountain Lake or Ochuio Biano, who was the visionary and holy man of the Taos Pueblo peoples in 1925 when Jung traveled to the Pueblo. That Jung was just given the secrets of the Taos Pueblo peoples by Mountain Lake because of Jung's charisma, because of Jung's magnetism, his personality. That's not entirely accurate. I have a paper on this where I really look at the the missing piece here, the missing link, and that was Jaime De Angulo, who was a mentor of the Beat generation poets that you were talking about, the San Francisco Beat Renaissance. In fact, he was a shaman ancestor, you could say, of that whole movement because he studied as an archaeologist, as an anthropologist. He was not an archaeologist. He was a psychomusicologist and an anthropologist who studied at Cal with Kroeber uh, and other important figures. And he spent over a decade of his life up in Northern California with the Achamawi peoples uh, of the Mount Shasta region of our state, and wrote books about his talks with the shamans or a medicine people, both a medicine man and a medicine woman. And so when he traveled to Zurich, Jaime De Angelo, he went out to a little island with Jung on his Jung sailboat, and they spent a few nights out there, I believe. And Jung actually paid Jaime De Angelo $500, which back, you know, in 1921 was actually a lot of money to get the secrets of the Taos Pueblo people. And the
but
story, it was
it,
the story. Jung
it,
wanted the creation story of the Mount Shasta people. And so Jaime delivered that, and Jung sent him wired him the money.
it wasn't just his charisma and another.
It was not just Jung, coming to America and getting uh, what the Taos Pueblo peoples had always kept as a secret. They would not divulge it to the anthropologists, but this anthropologist, Jaime De Angulo, paved the way before he picked up Jung near the Grand Canyon and drove him to the Taos Pueblo and made that link because he knew from his anthropological research how to talk to native peoples and develop their trust in a white uh, person. And of course, they had a lot to uh, be concerned about because there was a real trauma up in the Mount Shasta region uh, where the tribes up there had just literally been wiped out, during the Native American wars. And so, there was a long legacy of historical traumas there. And somehow Jaime had this wonderful capacity to develop friendships, authentic, genuine friendships, because he didn't put on, cultural airs. He lived with the people. He worked with them and learned from them. And um, so anyway, that's another story.
Yeah,
Mhm.
it's a beautiful story, that. Um, well, let's get on to William Everson and your book.
Sure.
What did he bring to the table? What?
Well, William Everson, first of all, was in the Dominican monastery here in Oakland, California. The Dominican priory as a lay monk. Um, 18 years he spent with the Dominicans before I met him. And he had, I think, the good fortune to have been at St. Albert's, which is the monastery here, when visiting priest Victor White was staying in Oakland. Victor White had been very good friends with Carl Jung and gave Jung so much understanding about Thomistic Dominican theology. It really helped Jung write his great works. Perhaps Answer to Job could never have been written without Victor White. So, so Victor White was Everson's spiritual director at St. Albert's, and so White introduced Everson to Jung's writings, and so Everson studied as much as he could of Jung. So by the time I knew him, he was really a Jung aficionado. I mean, he really knew his his Jungian studies pretty well, and he read a number of the contemporary works by the early classical Jungians. But before I went to Santa Cruz, I had read many of the early classical Jungians, so I had all that down too. And we used to have wonderful conversations about Jung's. So that really comes into our dialogue. The main reason I went down, John, was to interview Everson about the concept of the vocational archetype, which had been my research at UC Santa Cruz as the leader of those dream groups. And then later, I did my master's thesis, John F. Kennedy University, on vocational dreams. And I just published the book, Vocational Dreams, last year. Um, I published my research in that book. So I really took Everson's ideas much further and related them to what I call the nuclear symbol, which I actually used as a kind of a background methodology to interview him about his own childhood, where we actually traced the shaman archetype back to his adolescence when he used to identify with Native American uh, archetypes and play them out in his imagination. But the shaman's call is really uh, two pronged. On one side, we have the Jungian research on vocational dreams that he and I were conducting together and that I took forward. Secondly, is the 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 dialogues, the conversations we had about shamanism in the works of primarily Walt Whitman, Robinson Jeffers, and Bill Everson's work. So we talk at length about this concept of the shamanic archetype and how it enters into literature through poetry. And Everson himself had written a marvelous piece on the Pacific Coast as a literary region. So I talked to him also about that idea. What does the West Coast of California have to contribute to the national discourse and also world culture and Jungian psychology itself, which is where my main works have been, writing books about Walt Whitman, Robinson Jeffers, Herman Melville, and Emily Dickinson. Also D.H. Lawrence. I mean, that's a really very interesting work because Lawrence ended up in Taos, New Mexico, to try and heal himself from his tuberculosis. And when he heard the sound of the Taos drum, he went into some kind of deep. You can really see him going deep into that shamanic level of the psyche in this essay on New Mexico. It's a beautiful essay, and I've written about it.
And was Emily Dickinson, for example, from the West Coast, or?
Oh, Emily Dickinson was from Amherst, New England. Her grandfather was the founder of Amherst University, and she went to Mount Holyoke. That's where she did her 1 year of studies at Mount Holyoke. And she really, I think, brings something very novel into American poetry that we don't quite find in the same way in Melville or Whitman. There's a unique feminine quality to her voice, and boy, when she taps into this archetype of the medicine woman or the shaman, she is electric. I mean, she is really in touch with something that's very electrifying, like Everson was and Jeffers, and they were all somewhat, they had a connection to it. You could say it's the feminine that's been lost in patriarchy. The voice of the feminine, the voice of a woman who gives birth to the word in a way that's just and her particular way of writing poems. She has her own unique style, um, her own method, and yeah. So.
I just want to go back a little towards the vocational dream,
Mm. Hmm.
vocational archetype.
Hmm.
What does it mean in kind of practical terms? I mean, okay, this started with Everson, it seems to me, when students were coming along and they were probably thinking about their careers in a sense and all of that.
Yeah.
But what does it mean? What is this vocational archetype? I mean, what happens in our dreams, and how does it show us vocationally?
Hmm. Well, I can give you a very brief example in my own life. I was debating between staying in the experimental psychology program at UC Santa Cruz or boldly going my own way and writing my own individual major. in what would later be called depth psychology and religion. That was my major, the title. I came from a dream, and in the dream, I was uh, on a path, and I came upon two snakes, and one of them, they were king snakes, by the way, which is a very sacred totem, you could say, or ally in my unconscious. I've had thousands of dreams about this snake. And Don Sandner always commented on it in analysis. There's that snake again, he would say. He liked that. He really liked that the fact that I had this connection with this particular snake, and there it was on the path, and it was going down toward the town hall at Kresge College, where Everson taught his course. And it had, I looked very closely at it. It had very large eyes, and there was an eight-spoked wheel in each of the eyes, and behind the eyes there was like a universe with constellations and stars and light, emanating from the eyes of this snake. And it was like a very numinous dream, what Carl Jung would call numinous, using Rudolf Otto's term in his book Das Heilige, the Holy. Rudolf Otto coined this term, the numinous, and Jung just latched onto it. But it's that quality of luminosity, you could say, in dreams that really enlightens us. And it was that dream that led me to make my choice. So you could say that was a vocational dream. And it also had a shamanic dimension to it, because that king snake later became a real guide for me to follow my path and not get thrown off, by collective, conventional, considerations along the way, which is so easy for any of us to have happen. I mean, we all get hit with blows of fate, in our lives. Particularly around midlife, we go through some kind of major readjustment. And so that snake just continued to appear, at crucial moments in my destiny pattern and its unfoldment. And that's an image I trace back to my 7th year, when I caught my first California king snake up in the Mount Diablo region of California. So that it became what I call, in my vocational dreams book, in my research, of a nuclear symbol. And by nuclear symbol, I mean a symbol that's packed with the nuclear energies of the psyche, and is an organizing principle for one's life. And so a vocational dream can help us stay in touch with the self, what the ancient Hindus in the Vedas called the self with a capital S. And both William James and C.G. Jung adopted that term in modern psychology. And so the snake is a real primal symbol for the self, you see. And we see it everywhere in petroglyphs. I mean, in Australia, you have the Aboriginal peoples painting the snake on
The
rock carving.
the rainbow serpent as well. It's a big symbol.
Yes, yes. And even there, right behind your right
Mm.
shoulder, is the anima with the snake around her. Yeah, that's a beautiful painting.
So the snake was kind of your vocational guidance counselor, if we could put it
I
in
would,
modern educational parlance.
well, that's a very interesting way to put it, that I actually took counsel from the snake. In a certain way, I did, because I did have dialogues with the snake, and it dialogued with me later on. I mean, this is not just something Jung discovered as his own unique invention, active imagination, where we dialogue with the snake. This is an ancient method. The shamans were, using this technique. We know the archetype goes back 70,000 years. I mean, and the first evidence for it is a medicine man who was buried in the Shandahar cave up in northern Israel with 7 medicinal flowers or plants, medicinal plants, and 2 women buried by his side. So it's unclear what the how this burial happened, but it's been carbon dated to 70,000 BC. So you can see how ancient this archetype is. That's the only evidence we have in archaeology, other than the rock carvings, the petroglyphs. That's it's a very primordial symbol, and often the snake is one of the first. And also the circle and the mandala, you could say, the simple circle and the four-sided uh, square in the middle. You see this also. And I've seen it up in Northern California as far back as 10,000 BC, then the rock carvings up here in our native state. So it's everywhere. Shamanism is at the base of human civilization and culture. Without the shaman, civilization would probably perish, and so we're at risk today
Yeah.
because we're losing touch. And I think you're right. I think we've been mesmerized by by social media now and the news and everything. The visual has been taken over by by smartphones, and it's just hard to get away from it now. And
I could also think of it in terms of when Jung talks about the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. It's so easy to get swept away by the spirit of the times. And I mean, we are standing with AI and everything. We're standing
exactly.
at the beginnings of something very, very big that is happening.
Well, that's really where Jung was a shaman himself. I mean, in the Red Book, I mean, he really got in touch with the voices of the dead. You know, it comes through in the seven sermons to the dead.
Mm.
Interesting, it was seven sermons, you know. Um, and you know, the dead came back from Jerusalem, you know, because they could not find what they had sought. You know, this idea that the dead come to us and speak to us as ancestors. But
Are you there?
so he's also speaking about this thing. Um, he cites Jaime De Angulo there in the Dream seminars, so he does give him some credit. Um, But no, I think Jung had his own way of accessing the very deep ancestral layers. He called it the 2 million-year-old man. So he's going back in that metaphor, even beyond shamans. You know, he's going back to the first, Homo sapiens, uh, on the African continent. You know, because Leakey had made his discoveries when before Jung wrote that essay on the 2 million-year-old man, or was having dialogues about that. So what he meant was that the 2 million-year-old man in us is still in touch with instinct. You see, what is an archetype? Well, an archetype is an image of instinct. It's a self-portrait of the instincts. So the shaman is the one who has access to the deep instinctive layers of the psyche, and that's where it taps into the psychoid dimension. Because the psychoid is really connected to the body and the somatic unconscious. It's really memories that go deep into the blood, and into the cells and into the very DNA and the lower brain stem, the reptilian brain, the snake brain. And Jung writes about this. So Jung was well aware of this connection. He didn't write that much about shamanism, but he certainly opened a door, for us to take it further in post-Jungian research.
And you were talking about the vocational dream, right? But it's also leading on to something about identity that, you know,
Absolutely.
before the podcast started, we were having a quick chat about, well, I was thinking that identity is often being judged by race, gender, or whatever
Mhm.
in our modern conversation.
Mm.
But these deep dreams, these reptilian brain activated dreams or ancestral dreams or whatever, they're the spirit of the depths. What is it saying towards our
Well, the
identity?
spirit of the depths is where we understand what the modern culture is trying to bring into consciousness around gender, for example. The shaman was also the one in the tribes who cross-dressed, who assumed a feminine, the shaman as male, assumed sometimes uh, a feminine persona for the culture. Sometimes they were homosexuals of the tribe. So this whole discourse, and in my book on Walt Whitman, I get into this in depth because he was probably our first openly gay uh, poet in the United States. And uh, Whitman had a very maternal side. He had a deep connection to his mother, and he was a Quaker. And so he really valued the feminine principle and brought in uh, what gay men in our culture will often bring in a feeling element, you see. The poet can do that because the poet has access to emotion, supreme emotionality, Whitman called it. You know, it's not just the average emotion that we feel, but happiness with a capital H is the way he put it in Song of Myself. It's really that rapture or transcendent emotion that you see also in great mystics like Saint Teresa of Avila, who in her rapture, her ecstasy, uh, uh, it becomes a kind of a shaman figure for the Catholic Church. Uh, and that's why in my book on Meister Eckhart, I also talk about him as a shaman, as preacher, the shaman as preacher, you see. He speaks from of a depth that the church needs, to keep it alive, to keep the word alive, to keep it from stagnating into intellectual discourse and becoming what Everson calls uh, there's a term for it in the book that Everson used when he was talking about himself. Actually, he was aware of something in himself which was what he called a logical lunatic, where the logical mind, the rational mind can go on ad absurdum. We hear it on the news every day. I mean, it's just this political discourse that's just sometimes it's noise, and it really disconnects us from our sense of inner peace. We go to sleep, thinking about this murder that just happened, for example, down in Hollywood, Los Angeles, and you hear this discourse, and it just keeps people, frightened. So people go to sleep afraid and fearing and not at rest. And that's, you mentioned the sacred syllable Om. Well, Om really is A-U-M in Sanskrit. A is waking consciousness. Uh, U, U is waking, dreaming is the U, and U, A-U-M, is dreamless sleep. But then they say transcending these three states is superconscious vision called the fourth in the Upanishads. Now, the fourth is what the shaman has access to. And the first shamans in recorded history, in religion, I would say, that we have documentation on is the group of rishis in ancient India who wrote the Vedas, the ancient Vedas. They were literally chanted through these verses. And that's really what Everson was bringing in as a West Coast poet. This connection to this electrifying energy in the psyche that can transform society through the word, you see, the spoken word. And as a Dominican, he didn't become a preacher or a priest, Everson, but he had a connection through his Dominican studies to that prophetic word because he was very Catholic, Everson, as well as being a shaman poet. He was very connected to his faith. And
So,
that
so,
influenced me to write my thesis on Meister Eckhart, you see, who was the greatest Dominican preacher, uh, was that connection with Bill. I projected so much onto Bill of myself that was in potential and that I didn't know about. He carried something of the mantle of something in me of which I was unconscious at the time, or only partly conscious.
mm,
And that's the way it happens in vocational development is we latch on to a mentor figure who later leads us to our own destiny.
mm,
And in a way, that snake was the guide in that dream I shared to, becoming his teaching assistant, because I had that right before I became his teaching assistant, you see, and that just came out of the blue. Bill asked me, he selected me as his TA. It seemed like it was just a coincidence that I met him and he pulled me into
he,
his orbit,
he was the right person to meet at that
just
time,
the right,
let's say.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it seems what I get from, without knowing a lot about Bill Everson, is it seems to me that when he spoke in those classes, that he was almost taking people somewhere, wasn't he? He was transporting a little.
Absolutely. Well, no, he literally was. I mean, there were students who would like leave that classroom looking rather mystified, like they weren't sure what had just happened to them. And he really had a way to get under, a person's skin and plant a seed. Not everybody in the course, of course, found their vocation, you see.
Yeah.
Only you could say a relatively few. But that's the way, it happens that it takes time. Sometimes a student would later remember the course and remember Everson's words. I have a record of that by one student in particular who took uh, his course and also my dream group, and uh, and I wrote her final essay for the course as well, her narrative evaluation, as it was called back then. She wrote a beautiful paper, and she had a calling to be a poet. You see, it was called Birth of a Poet, the class. And the aim was not to birth the poet in everybody because there was 100 students, but it was in the literature department, you see. But many students came from other uh, disciplines. There were people coming from economics or oceanography, biology, science, people who wanted to take the class because they were puzzled about who they were, getting back to identity. Jung, of course, talks about this in depth in his beautiful essay, The Development of the Personality, where he speaks about the inner voice of vocation, that the charismatic individual is the one who hears the call, the vocation, and it's that heals him or her of their neurosis, you see. The neurosis is basically a defense against the inner voice that wants to speak to the conscious mind through the self or the collective unconscious and guide that person to some predestined vocation, Jung says. So Jung really had planted the seed for Everson's hypothesis in that essay. It's just he didn't take it far enough and coin the term vocational archetype, which Everson did. And I give him credit for that because I think that was one of his original novel contributions to analytical psychology. And and then I've taken that into my own field of research and in vocational dreams.
Getting back to our smartphones and all of that, it's the inner voice. And okay, not everyone may be a poet, but I was thinking when you were speaking of Hillman's, the poetic basis of the mind. I mean, that is also an important thing, to be able to see in that way. And to find more of our own voices, to find our own song. But then I like the way you're linking it with vocation as well, that's a creative act, a creative unfolding over time, and I think, Matthew Box, what's it
Yes.
called? Creation-centered spirituality. It seems to me that, I don't know, sometimes people think that there's enlightened people and non-enlightened people, but I like this creation spirituality where it's
Oh,
an
yes.
unfolding, unfolding, unfolding.
Well, Matthew happens to be a very good friend of mine and a colleague, and I've reviewed 7 of his books, and one of them is The Coming of the Cosmic Christ.
Mm.
Um, Creation spirituality I was onto because Matthew had published his book, Breakthrough, Meister Eckhart's Creation Spirituality in New Translation, in 1981 when I was doing my thesis on Eckhart. It's just what I needed because here was a person who actually, a Dominican, Matthew was a Dominican, who really knew his Eckhart and knew Thomas Aquinas like nobody else. I mean, he really read both Aquinas and Eckhart. And I studied that book at Santa Cruz when I was 25, and I never forgot it. And so I met Matthew after my book, The Shaman's Call, was published. He found my book, and then we started having lunch together and conversations. And I see a lot of parallels between creation spirituality and what I've called spiritual democracy. And he sees it as well. And he's since used the term a bit himself, spiritual democracy. Occupy Spirituality was one of the books he wrote, where he gave me credit in that book for the term. So he sees the link between his work and mine. And interestingly, it was Eckhart who brought us together. And Everson, because he knew Everson. He used to go down and talk to Everson at his home and interviewed him for his magazine, Creation Spirituality magazine. So Matthew and I have a lot in common in our background, ancestral background.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
different terminologies. I mean, what Matthew calls creation spirituality, I might read in Jung as the importance of the creative instinct. I mean,
Hmm.
it seems to me that
Hmm.
I remember Thomas More saying once that people come along to therapy and want to fix something, get something removed, like
Yeah.
the trouble with the relationship or whatever. But this other side of it is the creative instinct that needs to be nurtured or nourished or.
That's a beautiful way to put it, John. I think that's right. Because where else does creation spirituality come from but from the depths, of our psyches, which is instinct. And Jung warned constantly about this, that we've lost touch with our instincts. And so the way to return, to reconnect with instinct is through archetypal images. But visionary techniques are one way. Another is what you've called this auditory um, way. And that's something that's not mentioned enough in Jungian literature, is the power of the auditory uh, organ of the psyche, the ear, the inner ear, to hear, what the inner voice wants to say, and then to know how to go about speaking it in one's field, you see, of specialization, of study. and for a man like you, a podcaster, to be able to have a platform like this gives you a way to express your voice and make your vocation known, and to share it, with the culture and have an impact. So, so I agree. The poetic basis of the mind, I think Hillman did a marvelous job there. He does talk a lot about the creative instinct, Hillman. He takes Jung's idea further. Um, and then he does that also in the Soul's Code later. Although I can't follow Hillman completely when he talks about the bad seed. I don't think there's a bad seed in the human psyche, that the infant is born with evil. I just can't follow Hillman on that one. I just don't
I
think that.
was interested though in this idea of the daemon because when I first started reading what you were talking about with the vocational dream, I was thinking, well, this is probably what Hillman would call the daemon in the way
He
that
would call it the time. Yeah.
and there is that other area. There's shamanism, but there's that, what is it, Neoplatonism,
Yeah.
that we're all born with a daemon or a
Yeah. No,
calling.
he was coming right out of Neoplatonism. Plato,
Mm,
uh, the acorn theory. I mean, he really gets that from Plato and the Greeks. I mean, he was very steeped in Greek mythology and stayed away from Christianity.
with with a,
And
with a, with a relish.
yes, but he missed a lot, Hillman, in doing that,
Yeah.
and in a way biased his whole archetypal uh, uh, contribution, I think, to psychology uh, a bit with a certain one-sidedness around that,
Yeah.
because there's so much value in doing what Jung did, was really to try and understand the Judeo-Christian mythos and take that forward for the new millennium, the age of Aquarius, which gets into this New Age dialogue. I don't think Jung is New Age, and I don't think Hillman was either. But I do think Hillman misses a lot by constantly,
Well, we might say he had a bit of a hatred of Christianity if we
yes, I
wanted to
think
be
that's
honest.
probably correct. Yeah, yeah.
But it does strike me that back, thinking of his predilection towards Greek mythology, that Orpheus, like I was thinking this morning,
Yeah.
knowing that
Oh,
we were
beautiful.
speaking,
Well,
that he's a bit of a shaman figure. Like in our, when we wake up and we do all our political analysis in Hillman language, we're very analysis junkies, Apollo or whatever. Whereas Orpheus is that Greek figure that
that's
uh,
beautiful. I,
the
I
music.
love that. And actually, Murray Stein says that, Jungian analyst Murray Stein in Zurich, whose books, his collected writings I've just reviewed, and I did a psychobiography on him. The book was just published, a book on Murray Stein. He actually talks in his book Transformation about the German poet Rilke as a modern Orpheus. And he also writes a bit about the shaman and what he calls the shamanic countertransference in analysis. So I think that, and of course, he studied under Hillman. Hillman called Murray Stein to come to Zurich when he was 25. So, and he worked as an editor for Spring under Hillman.
Mm.
So he was influenced clearly by Hillman and had a real uh, I think, grasp of Greek myths and uh, so yes, I agree that the shaman is also there in Greek culture. It's just Hillman doesn't talk a lot about shamanism, as
No,
far as I
he
can
doesn't.
tell.
No.
Yeah, he somehow doesn't turn that stone over.
It's
And
it's it's Greek myth. And maybe the auditory factor, I would see him in that visual sense, I mean,
Oh,
as well,
yes.
often.
No, that's really a good point, John. I think
Mm.
that's true. The orator, the oratory. Yeah. And the one who hears the daimon, the voice of the daimon, you see. This is the shaman. When it's traced back uh, uh, beneath, the modern uh, uh, writer to the prophetic, which you see in ancient Greece, uh, I mean, the great poets of Greece. Robinson Jeffers, of course, was a real student of classical Greece, and you see it throughout all of his writings, his plays particularly. So Everson did a lot of research into this. Dear Judas and The Tower Beyond Tragedy, and where he takes the Greek myth of Clytemnestra and Orestes, in it's just beautiful. Jeffers' poetry, but where he connects to the Greeks, but then he goes deeper. He goes beyond the Greek civilization down into the underblows of the race, into the deep primordial depths where the shaman,
Just
you
hanging
know,
out.
yeah.
Um,
Well, as Emerson says, awaiting uh, uh, the one who can crack the sleepwalker's trance of the world above us, with the electrifying kinesis of the word, So Everson, as a prophetic poet, as a man who comes out of the biblical tradition, you could say, as a Dominican, he doesn't leave the Judeo-Christian roots, although he's very aware of the Greek influences as well, Everson, because of his master of Jeffers. Um, so yeah, no, I think you're onto it when you bring in Orpheus and Hillman's poetic basis of the mind. I think that's a beautiful metaphor that Hillman has, and I've loved that contribution that he made. But I just think that Hillman didn't go deep enough in
he
looking.
has
And I go
very
ahead.
strong likes and dislikes. I mean, which I don't have I personally like that someone's prepared to um, uh, express their peculiarities and their likes and their dislikes, and they're part of the tree, if you want to put it that way too.
Yeah,
Um,
no, I think that's very important in terms of individuality, like you were saying.
mm,
That's part of Hillman's uniqueness, his novelty as a post-Jungian, is that he
mm,
wasn't afraid to express his true values. Yeah.
exactly. But nevertheless, there are areas like indigenous cultures and shamanism and areas that he didn't touch on. And also, in some ways, in India, I always think, he went up the mountain in Kashmir, but he couldn't come down fast enough. Like he didn't really kind of like it up the top of the Indian mountains.
Didn't I didn't know
Um,
that.
so India's not so much that he's uh,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm.
can bring into the conversation. We can put it
Hmm.
that way.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I think India is pivotal in understanding shamanism, and that's why I've written my book on Swami Vivekananda and C.G. Jung, uh, Yoga in the West, because
Mm.
Vivekananda was the first teacher of Vedanta here in the West Coast in 1900. He started the Vedanta Center just a mile away from the Jung Institute in San Francisco, and uh, and so I really took an interest in his writings and learned so much from him about the history of shamanism in ancient India. And the role of the snake, it goes back to the ancient yogis and the Kundalini serpent, Kundalini yoga. So I was practicing Iyengar yoga at UC Santa Cruz when I was Everson's teaching assistant. So I was studying Hinduism and Buddhism under Jack Englar at the same time that I was writing about Eckhart, his Dominican theology.
Stephen, I know, we've gone over time, but I'm hoping we can have another conversation about some of this. And I was talking to you before, whether it's spiritual democracy or there's so many conversations we
Yeah,
could have. I did wonder though whether maybe you could finish with something because this idea, what I got from reading Everson and the Shaman's call is this whole idea of rupture, spiritual violence as somehow breaking the person open. It's probably something that not we don't all want to hear in a way, like the travails along the way, but it strikes me as being something so true. And I just wonder whether you could speak about that for a minute or so.
well, this, of course, is an idea that he gets from Jeffers. There was nobody who I think brought violence into uh, uh, American poetry more powerfully than Robinson Jeffers. When Everson pulled a book off of the shelf at Fresno State by Robinson Jeffers and he started to read it in the library, he, I think he probably went into some kind of a trance because he decided to leave Fresno State to withdraw from classes and become a nature poet of the San Joaquin. And it was Jeffers' voice that was so powerful. It broke what he calls the hymen in his soul. He uses a metaphor, of a sexual kind of uh,
Virginity.
rupture of something very virginal in the soul. You see that was very soft and you could say uh, feminine and at first, in his vocational development, he needed that masculine principle to powerfully break through, as Eckhart says, a Durchbruch, to break through something with a very powerful inflection of the word to crack something open, you see.
Mm.
And that's what Jeffers' poetry did. He never forgot it. And he describes it as a kind of a first conversion before he converted to Catholicism. His conversion to Jeffers. Jeffers became his master with a capital M, kind of like a Christ figure, for the disciples, the apostles. It was that powerful that Jeffers spoke to him in that kind of a way. So the poet, of course, knows a lot about this through um, experience. It's basically what William James called a religious experience. Something happens that totally transforms the character, the personality, and leads that person on their own path. To forge their own way in a culture that's not always conducive to charismatic vocation. Um, and Jung talks about this in his essay that, you know, um, in siding with convention, uh, the voice of society often says that person has gone, astray in some kind of way. But one has to stay true to one's individual path. So I would say, because of his later writings as a Catholic poet too, the cross became a symbol when directed inward for a kind of a crucifixion of the ego, that the ego has to be cracked open, you could say, by a violent thrust, in a side wound. that changes something and leads to a kind of a resurrection of a spirit. And John, this has been a real pleasure.
That's very powerful.
And I'd be delighted to speak with you about any topic you'd like to speak about.
Thank you very much. There's been so much in that conversation. Thank you.